So, yes, my name is Erica Wood, and I'm the hort agent in Hopkins County. So, I am over on the west side of the state. And so, today I'm going to talk to you about fall asters. And, really, my presentation today, I'm going to be focusing on a lot of our native species of asters that we see here in Kentucky. Like, if you are avid hikers and you're really looking at identification of some of these aster species, you should find this useful. But I will also, some of the asters that we talk about, I will mention which ones I've typically seen grown as ornamentals and which ones can, do pretty well in a landscape setting. So we'll go into all that. So I'll go ahead and just kind of move right into it. So I want to first kind of ask the question, what are asters exactly? For the most part, these are perennials. There are some annual asters that you might be able to find in the trade, but for the most part, we're talking about perennials. So these are plants that are going to be coming back year after year that you're not going to have to replant in your landscape. Often asters do bloom during the late summer to fall months. We do have some native species that bloom in the spring and early summer, but we're not going to focus on those today. We're just mainly focusing on the ones that you would typically see blooming right now, or kind of your months of August through November is kind of that time frame. With asters, they are members of the Asteraceae family. So they've got a whole family named after them. So that's pretty cool. A lot of times we associate the Asteraceae family as the daisy family. And then we have a lot of members like black-eyed Susans, coneflowers, sunflower zinnias that all are members of that family. And so before we kind of get into individual species of asters, I think it's good to kind of give some general characteristics of asters and then some general care information as well. And so with asters being a part of this family is very unique in their flowering structure. A lot of times these plants have what's known as a composite flower. And just to kind of put it basically, it's almost like you're looking at an individual flower, and that flower is actually made up of hundreds and hundreds of little flowers, essentially. And so when we're looking at an aster flower, it's actually made up of two types of florets, and those are disc and ray florets. So you can kind of see that on this picture here. The disc florets are kind of towards the center of the flowering structure. It's kind of what we often associate as the cone part, or the dome part of the flower. And so you can see it's made up of these individual little disc florets. And then the ray florets are kind of what we think of when we look at the flowering structure. They look like the petals, right? They're almost like the colorful part of the flowering structure, but they're actually like these individual flowers. And with asters, depending on the species, you may have, some that have more ray florets than others. But that's, again, just something that's very unique to this family of plants. And so that is the case, of course, again, for things like zinnias and sunflowers and coneflowers. Now, when it comes to the, physical appearance of asters, there's species are going to vary with their growth habits. So we do have some that are kind of more bushy and mounding, to others that are more upright, taller species. So we'll kind of mention that too. But, I think really why it's good to be talking about asters right now is like, why would we want to incorporate them in our garden? Why would we want to conserve them out in nature? And there's really a great reason for this. Asters are what we consider a keystone plant species. So these plants are really critical for preserving the biodiversity of our native landscapes. They are really important for our native insect populations, especially. They're really critical for helping to preserve them. And so when we think of asters, you know, the first thing we think of is just their lovely blooms, and their blooms provide a really great nectar source, a great late blooming nectar source for our pollinators. Our bee and butterfly populations just absolutely flock to this plant. But not only do they provide just like a fall food source, they're also what we consider a larval food source for different butterfly and moth species. And so when I say larval food source, it's essentially you have the adult butterflies that are laying eggs on the plant, those eggs hatch, and the caterpillars are feeding on the foliage. And those caterpillars can only feed on either that specific species or genus of plants. And so with asters, the silvery checker spot and pearl crescent butterflies rely on them, rely on asters as part of their life cycle, as part of their metamorphosis. So really important for that. So those are some of the insect populations that really rely on asters. And then, of course, wildlife in general, birds absolutely love the seeds of asters, and you'll see goldfinches especially come and flock to your asters. Asters have an interesting seed. So scientifically, these seeds are called an achene, and it's basically just like this little dry fruit. Often these fruits just contain one seed, and with asters, they're usually hairy. And a lot of times, these are pretty lightweight, that they can easily be dispersed by the wind. And so that's something that we'll kind of talk about with asters, is these plants are pretty brilliant self-seeders. So they can spread quite easily in a landscape, which can be pros and cons to that. So we'll talk about that too. So general care and maintenance, if you're considering putting asters in your landscape, again, I'll kind of talk about a few of the species that tend to do well in this setting. They're generally non-fussy plants. They really can tolerate a wide range of soil conditions, from dry to moist soils. Some of the woodland species may prefer a little bit more moist soil, but really, in general, the whole scope of the aster group, as long as you provide them with well-draining soil, they're going to do well. When it comes to light conditions, full to part sun is important. Even though some of these species are woodland species, a lot of them actually tend to flower better the more light they get. So even if it's an aster that, say, may grow like in a forest setting, a lot of times these asters will actually do a little bit better and bloom better for you if you give them a little bit more light than even what they're used to. So really what I'm saying here is, don't be afraid to put your asters in more sun conditions, because they should bloom more prolifically for you. Something else to keep in mind with asters is, with a lot of our upright species, they tend to flop over, especially as they develop their inflorescence, as they develop their flowers. It's just the weight of the flowers is too heavy for the plant. And so if you want it to look a little bit more aesthetic, or you just don't really want to mess with staking or caging your plants, you can be pinching the asters back during the growing season to help promote more bushiness and compactness. So generally, for asters, pinching probably the first few inches of that top growth prior to mid-July, so really end of June into early July, that can help to promote a better growth habit for the asters. And there might even be some asters where you could probably get away with pinching, twice. But that's just something to keep in mind there. Asters, as I mentioned before, they are they self-seed very easily. Some of them are also rhizomatous and can spread through underground rhizomes. So these can, in a way, become a little aggressive in the landscape. So you will want to allow plenty of room for them in your garden beds. So that's something to keep in mind. If they've really spread out, it's good to just every couple of years divide them up. And so just as a general rule, we say any fall blooming plants you divide in the spring, and then any spring blooming plants you divide in the fall. So that's just in general for perennial plants. So with these fall blooming asters, it's going to be best to divide them in the spring months if you can. Generally, asters don't have much in the way of disease issues. Sometimes they can develop powdery mildew. It's kind of more unsightly, though. I mean, it's really not, especially for it just being more of an ornamental, not going to be detrimental, unless you were growing them, for commercial purposes. That's pretty low concern. Something that is a little bit more concerning is aster wilt. We don't see it that often, but with some of our wilt diseases, it's caused by this soil-borne pathogen called fusarium. And, if you were to develop aster wilt, that could unfortunately just destroy your plants. But again, very rarely do we see a lot of issues with asters. They're, again, pretty low maintenance. So I wouldn't even be concerned unless you start to see odd symptoms on your plants. So let's go ahead and delve into some of the asters that we see, some native aster species that we see here in Kentucky. So we're starting off with the blue wood aster. And one thing that I'll kind of comment on is you'll notice with their scientific names of all these asters we're talking about, they all belong to the genus Symphyotrichum. And you'll kind of notice with asters, they underwent this reclassification. So, I have not a good sense of time, like 20, 30 years ago, it seems, where asters used to belong to their own genus called aster, and then they divided them. And so now a lot of our native aster species belong to Symphyotrichum. So you'll just notice that. Something else you'll notice with their scientific names is that scientific names of plants can really be a helpful factor with figuring out identification. So like with the blue wood aster, cordifolium, when we think cordifolium cordate, generally that means that the plant has these heart-shaped leaves. And so that's the case with this blue wood aster, with being able to properly identify it. So generally, this plant has cordate leaves. Kind of as it matures and the leaves like expand, they can become more narrow to almost lanceolate shaped, but they will kind of maintain that heart shape. These are primarily found in moist woodlands here in Kentucky. This is a more upright species that has these arching stems, and eventually it'll give way to these very loose panicles of the blue to violet colored aster. What's interesting, though, we had mentioned the ray florets and the disc florets, is if you look at this aster species in particular, the disc florets will start out yellow and then they're going to turn red over time. So really, as those flowers age, those disc florets are going to change color. So that's just kind of an interesting thing to note with this plant, because not all aster species do that. With blue wood aster, these are self-seeders very easily, even more so than other species, to the point where it's almost weedy. I really hate to call any native plant species a weed, because these are so beneficial, but it's just something that, you know, if you were to see this in the wild, you'd probably see pretty large colonies of it because of how well it self-seeds. And if you were to ever put this like in a woodland garden setting, in your own landscape, you know, to just keep in mind, because it can take over. So the next one is smooth aster. So this is one that I do see some cultivation. I don't see a lot of the bluewood aster, I should say that, much in cultivation. Smooth aster, I do see some of our native plant nurseries house it on occasion. Smooth aster is kind of found in these really niche limestone prairie patches in our state. This is kind of a moderate sized aster, getting up to 4 feet tall. This is a primarily unbranched plant, so it's going to be pretty much this single stalk. Now, it may develop branching at the top where its inflorescences come out, but for the most part, you know, this is not a bushy plant at all. This is completely an upright species. This is very pretty with its foliage. It has this lovely bluish green foliage, and if you touch it, something you'll notice is that it's smooth. And this is really a distinguishing characteristic of this aster, and why it's named the way it is because most asters, especially the ones we're talking about, are very hairy plants. They're usually rough and hairy to the touch with their foliage. But this aster is not that's not the case for this one. It is completely lacking hair, so it is very smooth to the touch. Something else to note is that a lot of times the leaves are going to have these rounded bases that curl around the stem. And that's something you'll kind of notice with asters too, is if you think of like a leaf structure, a lot of leaves have like this little piece called a petiole, which is almost like a little stem that's attached to the main stem. And with asters, they don't really have that. You'll see that a lot of times they have kind of these unique structures or these unique ways that the leaves kind of wrap around the stem of the plant. Now with the smooth aster, its blooms are a little bit different. Certainly you can have a little bit of variety where it could have kind of more blue to violet colored flowers. But with smooth aster, for the most part, especially when you see this in the wild, it's going to generally be lighter in color. Its blooms are going to be more of this pale lavender color, and just strictly with those yellow center discs. So that's another way to kind of distinguish it. And I should mention that all the asters we talk about, you can get some naturally occurring varieties in nature where the blooms, though typically blue or violet, may turn out pink or white, but they're pretty rare forms of asters. But it can happen. You can get some more of that pink or white coloration. All right. The next two asters that I'm talking about, the New England Aster and then the Aromatic Aster, these are the ones you're going to find widely in the, nursery trade, essentially. Like you're going to see these more in commercial production and easier to get your hands on. So especially if you're wanting to try to attract more pollinators to your garden, you're trying to incorporate a more pollinator friendly garden in your landscape, I would absolutely recommend New England and Aromatic Asters for that. You can find cultivated varieties of these two, kind kind of what we call, this is kind of a whole nother topic, but we have the concept of nativars, where there's these native plants that have been cultivated, and there's questions as to whether or not, they're just as good as the original. But, I would say, if you ask me, is it okay if I have a cultivar of this aster in my landscape? I would say go for it, because any aster is better for the pollinators than something like a chrysanthemum. And not that chrysanthemums aren't pretty. I love fall mums as well. But certainly if you're trying to, really help our pollinators and improve our local ecosystems, I definitely recommend getting your asters over your mums. But anyway, going back to the New England aster. So this is one that we widely find all over Kentucky. It's a great meadow prairie plant. So this is one that you're going to see that's going to do well in complete full sun conditions. So 6 or more hours of full sun. Now, this is this is one of our tallest asters. So they can get up to 6 feet tall. And I'm here to tell you, because I have these in my landscape, oh boy, do you need to be pinching these back? These would benefit almost even from at least 2 pinches, maybe pinching in June and then July, because they can get very tall and just flop over very easily. And I admit that I was not good this year with pinching mine back. And so mine got pretty tall, and I've had to actually kind of cage it up to keep it upright. So just something to keep in mind, that this is a upright species, and may benefit from a little prune. This plant generally gets pretty big leaves on it. These land-shaped leaves, they are rough to the touch and very hairy. With the blooms, they are going to be kind of more of this purple pink color. So you're not going to really see quite as much blue, although there are some cultivars out there that have kind of more of a blue tint. This is going to be kind of more of a pinky purple color with those yellow centers. But again, really great landscape plant. I see tons of native bee species on New England asters. I see a lot of bumblebees on here. I see a lot of butterfly species, like right now I have like tons of those skipper butterflies, and they're just like really eating this aster up. So New England aster is just a really good one to have, and it pairs really well with goldenrod. So if you want kind of that contrast of the purple and the yellow, that's a good, color contrast in your garden. All right, the other one that's a really good landscape plant that's native is our Aromatic Aster. And the good thing about this one is this is more of a compact species. This is more bushy. Could it benefit from a prune? Probably, because they can get quite tall, especially if they're in a really happy setting. If you give them, the right environmental conditions. These really, even though they're kind of found more in these niche prairies, they do generally really well as just a meadow full sun plant species. What is interesting about the Aromatic Aster, as you can imagine from the name, is that if you were to crush the foliage or just kind of like run your hand like through the plant, it has a very lovely fragrance to it. It is very aromatic. One thing I will note though, and I don't know what it is, but whenever I'm see Aromatic Aster, like I'm instantly drawn to it, like I have to touch it because it's so fragrant. But I will say the foliage is kind of sticky. So, maybe have a wipe or something with you if you touch it, because I don't know what it is. It maybe the oils or whatnot, it just has very sticky foliage. So be mindful of that. Its flowers are going to typically be smaller than other aster species. And this is going to be kind of more of your stereotypical blue-violet colored aster with the yellow center discs. But again, really great if you want an aster that is more bush-like, that's more compact, that is going to maybe look a little bit more aesthetically pleasing if you're one of those people that likes to have a more maintained garden bed. This would be the best aster for you. All right, this next one is the spreading or late purple aster. I don't really see this in the trade. This is just going to be more for like if you see this in our native Kentucky setting. This is a meadow plant as well, upright species, and it kind of has more of this open and airy form to it. The interesting thing about this one is kind of like what I had mentioned with the leaves before. It has these like oblong leaf shapes that form these kind of lobes at the base, and they kind of look like little ears. Yes, it kind of the leaves kind of remind me of Dopey's ears. So anyway, but these again, stereotypical blue to violet colored flowers. Now, these discs will vary in color, kind of similar to the blue wood aster, where they could be yellow or more of that reddish color to them. The Shorts aster. So this is one that I have seen a few of our native plant nurseries carry. I don't know how often they carry it, but I am seeing this a little bit more in the industry. So this is typically a woodland aster species. It's a little bit more on the smaller to moderate size range. You know, kind of like with some of the other asters, you know, the weight of the flowers may cause the plant to lean, and you can kind of see that in this picture here. So, you know, if you were to try to incorporate this in your landscape, it may benefit from a prune. Interesting characteristic with this one is it does have hairy foliage, but primarily just along the mid vein of the leaves. Everywhere else, it's pretty sparse. So it does differ from other aster species in that regard. This is going to have more loose, open panicles of flowers. This is going to vary with the color range of blue to violet. That we do see some white varieties out there. Like with the blue wood aster, these disc florets are going to turn red with age as well. And just some kind of interesting fact with the Shorts aster, it's actually named after a local botanist from Transylvania University, and that's Charles Wilkins Short. He was a botanist in the 1800s, so that's why it's called the Shorts aster, not just because of its size, but actually named after the botanist himself. All right. This is like a fun one. This is like one of my favorites to see. It's not one I typically see really though in the industry, but this is one to just kind of admire if you see this, like if you're going on a hike or something. But the Wavy-Leaf Aster, these again tend to flop over, more upright species. Just keep that in mind. It does branch a little bit, but can kind of look a little chaotic, I would say. And it again produces these really loose clusters of blue to lavender colored flowers. Now, the interesting thing with this aster is it is a very late bloomer. This is one of our really later asters to bloom. It's not, it could just be starting to bloom at this point, whereas most of our other asters may have started in August or September. This one's just starting now and is blooming through November, so very late bloomer. Interesting thing with this plant though is its leaves kind of have like these wavy edges, And the way it wraps around the stalk, it kind of has almost like this little winged stalk on it. And it may be hard to tell by the picture, but it's there. But that's one way that you can easily distinguish it from other aster species, is just the way it has almost like this wing point to it on the leaf. So pretty unique adaptation for the plant. Don't really know why it does that, but it's pretty cool. So my last thing that I want to mention today, because again, I'm kind of talking about these asters because these are native species and we see them in our landscapes. I want to provide you with some field guides. And these are field guides that I've used, that my master gardener groups have used, that might be very helpful, especially because a lot of asters can look the same, have similar growth habits, similar blooms. So if you're trying to figure out the differences between them, that can be helpful. So the first one I'm going to mention is The Wildflowers and Ferns of Kentucky by Thomas Barnes and S. Wilson Francis. And I have it actually with me right now. I actually keep this on me pretty well at all times. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Thomas Barnes, he was a really great wildlife biologist. He wrote many publications and books with plant identification and even different things when it came to, photography of our different native plant species. And his books are just very, very helpful. And so if you don't have any of his books, I would definitely recommend looking it up, because they're very useful for our native wildflower species, especially. The other one is actually, it's an oldie but a goodie. I say this because, this was written probably like in the 1970s, I would say, but it really can still be used today because we still see a lot of these same species. And this is A Guide to Wildflowers and Ferns of Kentucky by Mary E. Wharton. And actually, a lot of my master gardeners still use this and keep copies with them at all times. Now, something I'll kind of note, especially with this one, but it is the case with the Thomas Barnes, even though that one's a little bit newer. The scientific names aren't going to be correct at that point. Like, you'll see that the asters still belong to the genus Aster and not to Symphyotrichum. So that's just something to keep in mind, is, scientific names for these plants change all the time. And it's hard to keep up with. So just note that might be a little bit different when you're using these IDs, but you should still be able, the common names are still generally the same, and it's a similar Latin name for the most part, that you should be able to figure out what plant species is which one. But yeah, these are definitely two that I would recommend using. So definitely go and grab those if you haven't.